In the blistering heat of 53 BC, on the dusty plains near the town of Carrhae in northern Mesopotamia, the Roman Republic suffered one of the most shocking disasters in its history. On that day, an army led by Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's richest and most powerful men, was annihilated by the mounted archers of the Parthian Empire at the Battle of Carrhae. Nearly 20,000 Romans were killed. 10,000 more were captured alive. What happened to those prisoners after that catastrophe would echo across centuries and continents, giving rise to one of history's most haunting mysteries, the possibility that a Roman legion vanished into Central Asia and was later found in ancient China. Crassus had marched east seeking glory to rival Julius Caesar's victories in Gaul. Instead, he walked into a military nightmare. The Parthians avoided close combat, surrounding the Roman legions with fast, moving cavalry and unleashing relentless volleys of arrows. Roman shields locked into their famous formations, but they could not close the distance. When the battle finally collapsed, Crassus was dead, his army shattered, and Rome humiliated. The surviving legionaries were not ransomed or returned. Ancient sources state that thousands were marched eastward, deep into Parthian territory, to serve as forced garrison troops on the empire's far frontier. From that moment, they disappear from Roman records entirely. This disappearance is where hard history meets tantalizing possibility. Classical historians such as Plutarch mention that Roman prisoners were resettled near the Parthian borderlands, possibly in Margiana, close to modern Turkmenistan. These men, trained in Roman discipline and accustomed to heavy infantry tactics, would have been valuable to the Parthians as defensive troops against nomadic incursions. Over decades, their identity may have blurred, their Latin tongue replaced by local languages, their Roman standards lost or repurposed. Yet they would have retained distinctive methods of warfare, especially their use of tight, rectangular formations unknown to most Asian armies of the period. Fast forward more than a decade to **, 36 BC **, when the Han Dynasty of China was expanding aggressively westward. The Han Emperor had ordered campaigns to crush the Qing, new confederation, a powerful nomadic force that threatened China's northern and western borders. One of these campaigns, led by the general Chen Tang **, reached far into Central Asia, an area alive with trade, mercenaries, and displaced peoples moving along what we now call the Silk Road. In the official Han histories, particularly the Book of Han, there is a brief but extraordinary description of enemy soldiers who fought using a fish-scale formation, locking shields together in a manner unfamiliar to Chinese warfare. This single phrase has fueled decades of debate. To some historians, it is merely poetic language describing a local tactic. To others, it sounds eerily similar to the Roman testudo formation, in which soldiers overlapped shields to create an armored wall. The Chinese chroniclers had no reason to invent such a detail, nor any familiarity with Roman military doctrine. Yet they took the time to note it, suggesting they had encountered something genuinely unusual on the battlefield. After defeating these Western forces, the Han did something equally intriguing. They resettled a group of captured soldiers in a frontier village in what is now Gansu province, naming the settlement Liqian. The name itself is controversial. Some scholars argue it was simply a transliteration of a local term. Others point out that Liqian was also the Chinese name used to refer to distant western lands, sometimes associated with the Roman world, which the Chinese called Dakin. While this does not prove a Roman presence, it adds another layer of mystery to an already strange story. Over centuries, Liqian faded into obscurity, becoming an ordinary farming village on the edge of the desert. Yet travelers and later researchers noted something unusual about its inhabitants. Some villagers displayed lighter hair, higher nasal bridges, and eye colors uncommon in East Asia. While genetics alone cannot prove ancient Roman ancestry, these physical traits fueled speculation that Liqian's population might descend from foreign soldiers absorbed into Chinese society long ago. Modern archaeological work has been cautious and divided. No Roman coins, inscriptions, or unmistakable military equipment have been conclusively discovered at the site. This absence is significant, but not definitive. Soldiers captured in defeat would not have carried wealth or personal arms for long. Over generations, metal would be melted down, reused, or lost. Identity would be transmitted culturally, not materially, and eventually even that would fade under the weight of assimilation and time. What makes this story matter is not the romance of imagining Romans building villages in China, but what it reveals about the ancient world. The distance between Rome and Han China was vast, yet not empty. It was filled with trade routes, intermediaries, wars, and migrations. Ideas, people, and technologies moved far more than ancient historians once believed. A Roman legion ending its days thousands of miles from the Tiber is not impossible within this interconnected system. It is improbable, controversial, and unproven, but it forces us to reconsider how rigid we imagine ancient boundaries to be. The vanishing of Crassus's prisoners remains one of history's great unanswered questions. They were real men with names, families, and a shared identity forged in Roman discipline. Whether they died anonymously on a Parthian frontier, were absorbed into Central Asian tribes, or marched unknowingly toward the edge of the known world, their fate reminds us how easily individuals can vanish from the historical record while still shaping it in subtle ways. In the next section, the story moves east along the Silk Road, examining the Han campaign in detail and the evidence that brought Rome and China into the same shadowed narrative. In 36 BC, nearly 17 years after the disaster at Carrhae, the focus of world history had shifted thousands of kilometers eastward. While Rome was locked in civil wars between Octavian, Antony, and the assassins of Caesar, the Han Dynasty was fighting a struggle of its own for control of Central Asia. This conflict would unknowingly intersect with the fate of Rome's lost soldiers, not through diplomacy or trade, but through violence on a distant frontier where empires collided in silence. The western regions beyond China's Jade Gate were unstable and dangerous. Nomadic confederations such as the Xiongnu dominated the steppe, raiding Chinese territory and threatening vital trade routes. For decades, the Han court had relied on uneasy alliances, marriages, and tribute to keep these enemies at bay. By the mid-1st century BC, that strategy collapsed. A powerful Xiongnu leader named Zhizhai broke with his rivals and carved out his own dominion in the far west, near modern Kazakhstan. From there, he attacked caravans, disrupted Silk Road commerce, and mocked Han authority. The Han response was decisive. A seasoned general named **Chen Tang**, acting with bold independence, organized a long-range expedition without waiting for full imperial approval. His army marched west across deserts, rivers, and hostile territory, relying on local allies and precise logistics. This was not a clash of civilizations in the modern sense, but a brutal frontier war fought far from imperial capitals, where survival mattered more than ideology. In the summer of 36 BC, Chen Tang's forces reached Zhizhai's fortified city. Ancient Chinese records describe it as a stronghold reinforced with wooden palisades and earthworks, defended by a mixed garrison of warriors drawn from multiple ethnic backgrounds. These men were not purely nomadic horsemen. They fought on foot as well, resisting Han assaults with disciplined cohesion. It was during this siege that Chinese historians recorded a detail that would echo through modern scholarship. According to the Book of Han, some of the defenders fought in a formation described as fish scale, locking shields together to form a solid wall. This caught the attention of the chroniclers because it differed sharply from steppe warfare, which emphasized mobility and archery rather than static defense. Chinese infantry tactics existed, but the description suggests something foreign, deliberate, and trained. To a Han observer, it was strange enough to document carefully. After days of fighting, the fortress fell. Zhizh, I was killed, his head sent back to the Han capital as proof of victory. Thousands of prisoners were taken. Among them was a distinct group of soldiers who were not nomads, not Chinese, and not easily categorized. The Han authorities made a calculated decision. Instead of executing or dispersing them, they resettled these men in a frontier region of Gansu, placing them under imperial supervision as military colonists. This was standard Han policy. Throughout Chinese history, captured soldiers were often relocated to border areas where they could serve as buffers against future threats. What makes this case exceptional is the possible identity of those soldiers. If they were indeed descendants of Roman prisoners from Carrhae, their journey would represent one of the longest forced migrations of trained troops in antiquity, spanning from Mesopotamia to the fringes of China over several decades. The settlement assigned to them became known as Liqian. Chinese texts use this name without explanation, assuming the reader would recognize it. Elsewhere in Han sources, Liqian is also used as a term for far western lands, sometimes associated with Dakin. The distant empire scholars now agree refers to Rome. This linguistic overlap does not prove Roman origin, but it reveals how the Chinese conceptualized the Western world as a series of layered, half-known regions rather than a single monolithic place. Life for these resettled soldiers would have been harsh and isolating. The Gansu corridor was a strategic choke point of the Silk Road, but it was also exposed, arid, and vulnerable to raids. Military colonists were expected to farm, defend their settlements, and integrate into Han administrative systems. Over time, they would have adopted Chinese clothing, language, and customs, especially as intermarriage blurred cultural lines. Their children would grow up Han subjects, even if fragments of foreign memory lingered in family traditions or physical appearance. The absence of Roman material culture at Liqian is often cited as evidence against the theory. Yet this absence is not surprising. These men were prisoners, not colonists carrying symbols of identity. By the time they reached Chinese territory, any Roman equipment would likely have been lost, confiscated, or destroyed. Iron was precious. Shields, helmets, and weapons would have been melted down or repurposed, long before archaeologists ever had a chance to find them. What survives instead is a convergence of circumstantial evidence. The timing aligns, the military description aligns, the resettlement policy aligns. None of these elements alone proves the presence of Roman legionaries, but together they form a pattern too coherent to dismiss casually. This is why the theory has endured, not as sensational fantasy, but as a serious historical hypothesis debated by respected scholars. More importantly, this episode challenges how we imagine ancient isolation. Rome and Han China never met as empires, yet their actions rippled outward until they touched indirectly through intermediaries, mercenaries, and displaced soldiers. Power flowed along the Silk Road not just in silk and silver, but in human lives uprooted by war. A Roman legionary and a Han peasant lived worlds apart, yet the machinery of empire drew them into the same frontier landscape. By the 1st century CE, Liqian had become indistinguishable from other Chinese settlements. If Roman blood survived there, it did so quietly, diluted across generations. The legion, if it ever existed in this form, did not conquer China or leave monuments. Its legacy is far subtler, embedded in a line of text, a strange formation described by a careful historian, and a question that refuses to disappear. In the next section, we will examine modern investigations, genetic studies, archaeological debates, and why historians remain divided. The story of the vanished legion does not end in antiquity. It continues today as scholars try to separate evidence from myth and determine whether Rome truly reached the edge of the ancient Chinese world. By the late 20th century, the mystery of the vanished Roman legion entered a new phase. What had once lived only in footnotes and speculative essays now faced the scrutiny of modern archaeology, genetics, and interdisciplinary history. Scholars, journalists, and local officials converged on one small place in northwestern China, searching not for legends, but for proof. Their efforts revealed how fragile the line is between historical possibility and historical certainty. The village of Liqian lies in the Hexi corridor of Gansu province, a narrow stretch of land that once served as China's western gateway. This corridor was vital to the Silk Road, linking the Han Empire to Central Asia and beyond. For centuries, armies passed through this region, along with traders, refugees, and prisoners of war. Any serious investigation into Liqian had to begin by recognizing that it was never isolated. It was a crossroads, and crossroads blur identities. Early modern interest in Liqian, intensified after Western historians, revisited the Roman prisoner hypothesis in the mid-20th century. The idea gained wider attention when physical anthropologists noted that some villagers exhibited lighter hair pigmentation, deeper set eyes, and facial structures atypical for East Asia. Photographs circulated widely, and the story quickly captured the public imagination. To many observers, the faces seemed to whisper of Rome, yet professional historians responded with caution. Physical traits alone, they argued, prove nothing. Central Asia has always been genetically diverse. Greeks left descendants after Alexander's campaigns. Sogdians, Tocharians, Persians, and countless others moved through the region over millennia. A light-haired child in Gansu could descend from any number of ancient populations. Without material culture or written records directly linking Liqian to Rome, speculation risked outrunning evidence. Archaeological excavations followed. Teams surveyed burial sites, fortifications, and settlement layers around Liqian, searching for anomalies that might suggest a foreign military colony. What they found was thoroughly Han Chinese in character. Pottery styles, burial customs, and architectural remains all aligned with known Han frontier practices. This disappointed many, but to historians it was not unexpected. If Roman soldiers had been resettled there, they would have been absorbed into Han systems immediately, their material footprint erased within a generation. Genetic studies were then proposed as a more definitive test. In the early 2000s, limited DNA sampling was conducted among Liqian residents. Some results suggested the presence of Western Eurasian genetic markers at slightly higher frequencies than neighboring populations. Headlines proclaimed that Rome had been found, but geneticists urged restraint. The samples were small. The markers were not uniquely Roman. They could just as easily reflect ancient Indo-European populations known to have lived in the region long before the Han Dynasty. More rigorous genetic research later reinforced this caution. Larger studies showed that while Liqian's population does contain mixed ancestry, it falls well within the expected genetic diversity of the Hexi corridor. There was no clear signal that could be traced specifically to Italy or the Mediterranean. From a scientific standpoint, the case for direct Roman descent weakened rather than strengthened. This did not end the debate. Instead, it shifted its focus. Increasingly, scholars asked a different question, not whether Romans can be proven to have lived in Liqian, but whether the historical circumstances make it plausible that Roman, trained soldiers could have reached Han territory at all. On this point, the answer is more nuanced. The movement of prisoners across empires was common in antiquity. The Parthians had every incentive to relocate Roman captives far from their homeland, using them as military assets in volatile regions. Over time, those men could have been sold, transferred, or captured again by other powers. Central Asia in the 1st century BC was a mosaic of shifting alliances and conflicts. The idea that descendants of Roman prisoners ended up fighting for a Xiong new ruler is not implausible. It is simply unprovable with the evidence currently available. Chinese historical records themselves deserve careful consideration. The Book of Han was not written as a legend or a curiosity. It was an official court history, compiled with administrative precision. When its authors noted unusual battlefield formations, they did so because such details mattered. They reflected real encounters with unfamiliar tactics. This lends weight to the argument that something genuinely foreign was present during the campaign against Zhizhou. At the same time, historians warn against reading modern assumptions into ancient texts. Descriptions like fish scale formation are metaphorical by nature. Chinese writers often used vivid imagery to describe unfamiliar phenomena. A disciplined shield wall does not automatically equal a Roman testudo. Similar formations existed elsewhere, and coincidence remains a possibility. Why, then, does the theory persist? Because it sits at the intersection of what we know and what we cannot quite explain. There is a gap in Roman history after Carrhae where thousands of soldiers vanish. There is a moment in Chinese history where foreign infantry appears unexpectedly. Between those 2 points lies Central Asia, a region that absorbed and erased countless identities without record. The story survives because it fits, not perfectly, but intriguingly. Equally important is what the debate reveals about historical method. Modern audiences often demand definitive answers. History rarely provides them. Instead, it offers probabilities, contexts, and competing interpretations. The Lost Legion of China is a case study in how historians balance evidence against imagination, how they resist the allure of a good story when proof remains elusive. For China, the story underscores the reach of Han imperial power and its ability to integrate outsiders into its frontier systems. For Rome, it serves as a reminder of vulnerability. Roman military invincibility was a myth even in antiquity, and Carrhae shattered it brutally. The fate of those captured soldiers symbolizes the limits of Roman control and the indifference of history to individual suffering. Whether or not Romans truly lived and died in Liqian, the discussion itself has value. It highlights the interconnectedness of the ancient world, where no empire existed in isolation. It shows how people moved, willingly or not, across immense distances long before globalization became a modern concept. In the final section, we will step back and assess the broader consequences of this mystery. What does it change, if anything, about our understanding of Rome, China, and the ancient world? And why does the idea of a lost legion still captivate historians and audiences today, even in the absence of absolute proof? By the time the Han records were compiled and the Roman world moved into the imperial age, the men captured at Carrhae had become the kind of people history loses most easily. Soldiers taken alive, marched far from home, and absorbed into someone else's borderlands. If the Lost Legion story has a final lesson, it is this. The ancient world was not a set of sealed civilizations separated by empty space. It was a single, bruised continent of competing powers, where the movement of prisoners, mercenaries, merchants, and refugees created invisible connections long before any official embassy ever crossed the whole distance. What is historically solid is the chain of events that makes the mystery possible. In 53 BC, Crassus's invasion ended in catastrophe at Carrhae, with thousands of Romans captured instead of killed. Ancient writers report these prisoners were deported eastward by the Parthians, likely to serve as a defensive garrison on the empire's northeastern frontiers. That basic pattern fits what we know about Parthian strategy. Relocate dangerous captives far from their homeland, use their labor and military value, and keep them in regions where their loyalty matters less than their utility. From the Roman point of view, they vanish because Rome had neither the reach nor the leverage to retrieve them. The missing 10,000 are not a poetic number. They are an administrative silence created by defeat. What is also historically solid is the Han expansion into Central Asia and the way it transformed the Silk Road from a trading route into an imperial frontier. The Han did not treat the western regions as distant curiosities. They fought wars there, installed client rulers, built garrisons, and moved populations to stabilize borders. A campaign like the 36 BCE expedition against Carrhae makes perfect sense inside that system. It also makes sense that the Han would resettle a captured, militarily useful group into the Hexi corridor as a controlled community of frontier colonists. That is not sensational. It is ordinary imperial policy. The mystery begins where these two solid histories might overlap. The description of an unusual infantry formation in the Han sources, and the later name Liqian attached to a settlement tied, at least in later imagination, to the far west. If a Roman derived unit, or even a unit trained in Roman-style shield discipline, had survived in Central Asia as mercenaries or forced auxiliaries, it could have ended up in Carrhae's service. That would not require a straight line march from Mesopotamia to China. It could happen through decades of reshuffling, Parthian relocation, local wars, capture by steppe forces, resale, recruitment, and finally collision with a Han expedition. Central Asia was full of armed men living by contract or coercion. In that environment, a distinctive tactic could survive longer than a distinct identity, but the decisive question is not whether the story is possible. It is whether the evidence meets the standard of proof. On that point, most modern specialists remain skeptical, and the reasons matter. The phrase fish-scale formation is suggestive, yet not specific. A disciplined shield wall is not uniquely Roman, and Chinese chroniclers often used metaphor to describe unfamiliar things. The place name Liqian is intriguing, yet names travel easily across maps without carrying precise ethnographic meaning. Physical appearance among villagers is emotionally persuasive, yet scientifically weak in a region shaped by millennia of migration. And when genetics was finally applied, the best known peer-reviewed results on paternal lineages did not support a Roman mercenary origin, instead finding the Liqian sample consistent with local and Han majority patterns. That does not disprove that any Western soldiers ever settled there, but it does undercut the confident version of the legend in which Liqian is essentially a Roman village preserved in China. So why does this story still matter, even if the Roman conclusion remains unproven? Because it forces a more important correction to the way people picture antiquity. Rome and Han China were not ignorant bubbles. They were aware of powerful states far beyond their borders, mostly through intermediaries like Parthians and Central Asian traders. Chinese texts used the term Dakin for the Roman world, and later records describe long distance goods, customs, and governance in ways that show sustained second-hand knowledge. Rome, for its part, prized Eastern luxuries and understood that silk came from the far side of Asia, even if the exact geography remained blurred. Direct state-to-state contact was rare and often blocked by middle powers who profited from controlling the route, but information and objects still moved. The world was connected, just unevenly, with filters and distortions imposed by whoever controlled the corridors between empires. The Lost Legion theory also matters because it shows how a single detail in a primary source can ignite centuries of interpretation. One short description of formation and one settlement name became a bridge that modern readers want desperately to cross. That desire is human. It turns history into narrative, gives the vanished dead a destination, and makes the Silk Road feel tangible. But it also exposes a danger, the temptation to treat possibility as fact because the story feels complete when it ends with Romans in China. Responsible history does the opposite. It keeps the story open where the evidence stays thin. If anything, the most profound consequence is the reframing of Carrhae itself. In popular memory, Carrhae is Rome's humiliation and Crassus's folly. In a broader Eurasian frame, it is also a moment when Roman military labor entered the Asian interior as a displaced resource. Defeated soldiers became tools in other people's strategies. That is the hardest truth in the legend, and it is true whether or not Liqian was their final stop. Empires did not only clash with each other through battles. They were linked by the afterlives of battles. Captives, refugees, and mercenaries who carried skills across borders without permission. Even the faint possibility that a Roman tactical habit surfaced in a Han chronicle is enough to remind us that human expertise can travel farther than flags. For your YouTube audience, the most honest ending is also the most powerful. The story is a real historical puzzle, not a solved romance. A Roman legion did vanish from Roman records after Carrhae. Han armies did fight deep in Central Asia and recorded unusual defenders. A settlement called Liqian exists and became the focal point of a theory. Modern archaeology has not produced definitive Roman artifacts there, and modern genetics has not confirmed a Roman origin for the village population. The mystery remains unresolved, balanced between a plausible chain of human movement and the strict demands of evidence. And that unresolved tension is exactly why it belongs in world history. It keeps the map from lying to us. It reminds us that ancient borders were porous, that distance did not prevent contact, and that ordinary people, especially prisoners, could be carried across continents by forces they did not control. Whether the eagles of Rome ever truly cast a shadow on a Han frontier village, the vanished legion still delivers a real, verifiable lesson. Eurasia was one connected arena, and war was one of its most powerful engines of connection.